In a quiet town, a heated exchange unfolds at a memorial park. A vibrant, outspoken woman berates a retired veteran, calling him a loser for his past service. Clutching a portrait of his younger self in uniform, the old man stands silently as his wife trembles beside him. But what the veteran's wife says next silences the crowd and reveals a truth so heart-wrenching, it leaves everyone, including the woman, in tears. It was a bright morning in the tranquil town of Westwood, and the annual Memorial Park gathering had brought together families, veterans, and local residents. Beneath the sprawling oak trees, rows of white chairs faced a small stage adorned with flags, flowers, and photographs of soldiers who had sacrificed their lives. Among the crowd stood James Jim Warren, an elderly man dressed in his slightly worn military uniform, with medals pinned neatly on his chest. He was a man of quiet dignity, his presence commanding respect even in his silence. By his side was his wife, Mary, her silver hair tied back into a modest bun. In her hands, she held a framed portrait of Jim in his youth. The photograph depicted a younger, determined Jim in full uniform, his sharp eyes full of purpose. Mary clung to the portrait as if it were a lifeline, knowing all too well the weight it carried for her husband. The atmosphere was one of quiet reverence until a voice pierced through the solemnity. It was loud, confrontational, and dripping with disdain. "What are we even celebrating here?" Heads turned as a woman with strikingly colorful hair, dyed in vivid shades of red, blue, yellow, and green, marched toward the stage. She wore a sleeveless lavender blouse and jeans, her fiery demeanor making her the center of attention. Some in the crowd exchanged uneasy glances, while others murmured quietly. The woman's bold appearance and brash tone were in stark contrast to the subdued mood of the gathering. "All this pomp and ceremony for what?" she continued, her voice rising. "War? Death? People throwing their lives away for nothing?" The crowd fell silent, stunned by her words. Mary instinctively tightened her grip on Jim's arm, sensing the tension radiating from him. Jim, however, stood still, his expression unreadable. The woman pointed directly at Jim, her eyes narrowing. You're wearing that uniform like it means something, like it makes you a hero. But it doesn't. It just makes you a pawn in someone else's game, a loser who followed orders." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Mary's face flushed with anger, but Jim remained calm, his gaze fixed on the woman. He didn't flinch or react, but Mary could feel the heaviness in his breathing. "Do you have any idea what you're saying?" Mary finally spoke, her voice trembling but firm. "Do you understand the sacrifices men like my husband have made?" The woman scoffed, crossing her arms. "Sacrifices? For what? So politicians can pat themselves on the back? People like him," she jabbed her finger toward Jim, "are clinging to the past, pretending it matters." Mary opened her mouth to respond, but Jim gently placed a hand on her shoulder, signaling her to stop. He stepped forward, holding the framed portrait of his younger self. His hands were steady, but his eyes carried a depth of emotion that couldn't be put into words. "This," he said, his voice low but firm, "is not about clinging to the past. It's about remembering the lives that were lost, the people who never came home." The woman hesitated for a moment, as if caught off guard by his calm demeanor. But she quickly regained her composure, her expression defiant. "And what good does that do? Remembering doesn't change anything. It doesn't bring them back. It just keeps everyone stuck in a cycle of pain and loss." Jim looked at her, his gaze steady. "You're right," he said. "It doesn't bring them back, but it honors their memory. It reminds us of the cost of freedom, and it teaches us to value the peace we have now." The woman rolled her eyes. "Freedom? Peace? Those are just words. Empty words used to justify pointless wars." Mary couldn't hold back any longer. "How dare you?" she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "You don't know anything about my husband or what he's been through. You don't know what it's like to lose everything and still stand tall." The crowd murmured again, some nodding in agreement with Mary's words. The woman seemed to waver, her confidence faltering for the first time. Jim remained silent, his eyes never leaving the woman. He could see the anger and frustration in her, but he also saw something else, a pain she was trying to hide. He knew that kind of pain all too well. Finally, he spoke again. "What's your name?" The woman blinked, surprised by the question. "Why does that matter?" "Because I'd like to know who I'm speaking to," Jim said. "I'd like to understand why you're so angry." She hesitated before answering. "It's Lisa." "Well, Lisa," Jim said, "you're right about one thing. War is terrible. It takes, and it never gives back. But the men and women who serve, they do it not because they love war, but because they love their families, their friends, and their country. They believe in something bigger than themselves." Lisa looked away, her colorful hair casting a shadow over her face. For a moment it seemed like she might respond, but instead she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Jim let out a deep sigh, his shoulders relaxing. Mary placed a hand on his arm, her eyes filled with pride. "You handled that well," she said softly. "I hope so," Jim replied, "but I wish I could have reached her." As the ceremony continued, Jim and Mary stood together, holding the portrait of a younger Jim and the memories of a lifetime filled with sacrifice, loss, and love. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows over the park, the hum of conversations replaced the awkward silence that had followed Lisa's departure. Mary and Jim found themselves a quiet corner away from the murmurs of the crowd, the framed portrait still clutched in Mary's trembling hands. "Jim, you should have let me speak my mind," Mary said, her voice a mix of frustration and concern. "That woman had no right to talk to you like that." Jim gave her a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's not about what she said, Mary. It's about why she said it. Anger like that comes from somewhere." Mary sighed, shaking her head. "You're too kind, Jim. Too patient. Not everyone deserves it." Jim reached for the portrait in her hands, his fingers brushing against the worn edges of the frame. He stared at the younger version of himself, his face set in determination and hope. The image brought back memories he had tried to bury for decades. "She doesn't know," he murmured, more to himself than to Mary. "She doesn't understand what this uniform represents, what this picture holds. It's not just a memory. It's a story." Mary's eyes softened as she watched her husband. She had seen that look before, the faraway gaze that meant he was slipping into the past. She placed a comforting hand on his arm, grounding him. "Tell me, Jim," she said gently, "what are you thinking about?" Jim hesitated, his thumb tracing the edge of the glass over the photograph. "That day," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. "The day this picture was taken, it was supposed to be a moment of pride, of accomplishment. But all I can remember is the fear, the weight of responsibility." Mary nodded, encouraging him to continue. "It was the day before we left for the mission," Jim said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A mission that changed everything. I remember standing there in that uniform, smiling for the camera, pretending to be brave. But inside, I was terrified. I knew what was at stake. I knew some of us wouldn't make it back." Mary tightened her grip on his arm, her heart aching for him. "You did what you had to do, Jim. You led those men with courage." Jim closed his eyes, the memories flooding back. "They were more than just soldiers to me, Mary. They were my brothers. We trained together, fought together, laughed together, and when the time came, they trusted me to lead them." He paused, his voice breaking. "But I couldn't save them. No matter how hard I tried, no matter how much I planned, it wasn't enough. They gave their lives for me, for each other, for the mission. and I came back carrying their memories, their sacrifices." Mary's eyes filled with tears as she listened. She had heard bits and pieces of this story before, but Jim rarely spoke about it in detail. The pain in his voice was raw, unfiltered, a testament to the depth of his grief. "You wear that uniform because it's the only way to keep them close," Mary said softly. "To honor them." Jim nodded, his eyes still fixed on the portrait. "It's not just a uniform, Mary. It's a reminder of the lives that were lost, the bonds that were forged, and the price that was paid. It's a way to say, I haven't forgotten you. I never will." The weight of his words hung in the air, a poignant silence enveloping them. Mary reached up to wipe a tear from her cheek, her heart swelling with love and admiration for the man she had spent her life with. "Do you think Lisa will ever understand?" Mary asked after a while. Jim sighed, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe. Maybe not. But I hope she does. Not for my sake, but for hers. Anger like hers can eat you alive. It blinds you to the sacrifices of others, to the good in the world. If she can find a way to let go of that anger, to see the bigger picture, maybe she'll find peace." Mary leaned her head against his shoulder, drawing strength from his quiet resilience. "You're a good man, Jim. A better man than most. And I'm proud of you, for everything you've done, for everything you've endured." Jim placed a gentle kiss on her forehead, his voice tender. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mary. You've been my anchor, my reason to keep going. Even when the memories threatened to drown me, you were there, pulling me back to shore." The two of them sat there in silence for a while, the portrait resting between them like a bridge connecting the past and the present. Around them, the park buzzed with life, children laughing, birds chirping, and the hum of conversations blending into a soothing symphony. But for Jim and Mary, the world seemed to fade away, leaving only the weight of their shared history and the unspoken understanding that some wounds never fully heal. As the ceremony continued in the background, Jim made a silent vow to himself. He would keep wearing the uniform, not for glory or recognition, but as a testament to the men who had made the ultimate sacrifice. And he would keep telling their stories, even to those who didn't want to listen, because their voices deserved to be heard. The ceremony drew to a close as families began to trickle away from the park. Some stayed behind, lingering by plaques and memorials, whispering thoughts to loved ones long gone. The air was heavy with stories unspoken, legacies etched in stone. Jim and Mary remained seated in their quiet corner, both lost in thought. Jim cradled the portrait, his grip firm but reverent. A sudden rustling caught their attention, and when they looked up, Lisa was back. Her colorful hair glistened in the sunlight, but her bold expression was now replaced by something softer. Curiosity, perhaps, or uncertainty. She hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to approach. Mary, who had been simmering with unspoken emotion since the confrontation, felt a surge of heat rise within her. "Lisa," she said, her voice firm and deliberate, breaking the silence before the younger woman could speak. Lisa flinched but didn't back away. I came to—" She trailed off, her gaze darting between Jim and the portrait in his lap. Mary stood, brushing off her dress as she fixed her gaze on Lisa. "You have a lot of nerve coming back here," she said sharply. "Do you know what it's like to stand beside a man who gave everything to protect people he didn't even know? Do you understand the cost of the words you threw at him like they were nothing?" Lisa opened her mouth to respond, but Mary didn't let her. "No, you don't. But you will." Jim gently tugged at Mary's hand, trying to calm her, but Mary shook her head. "No, Jim, let me speak." She turned back to Lisa, her eyes brimming with emotion. "You called my husband a loser, as if the years of pain, the nights he woke up screaming, and the friends he buried mean nothing. You don't see the man who carried the weight of his fallen brothers every single day." Lisa's face reddened, her arms wrapping around herself as if shielding against Mary's words. "I didn't mean it like that," she said quietly, but Mary's voice only grew steadier. "When Jim came back from the war, he wasn't the man I married. He was a ghost, haunted by what he'd seen and done. But he didn't give up. Do you know why?" Mary stepped closer, her voice breaking slightly. "Because he had to live. For them. For the men who didn't get to come home." Jim's hand tightened around the portrait, his knuckles white. "Mary, that's enough," he said softly. But she shook her head again, her tears falling freely now. "No, Jim, it's not enough. She needs to hear this. People like her need to know what men like you endure so they can stand here and speak their minds without fear." Lisa wiped at her eyes, her mascara smudging. "I didn't realize," she began, but Mary cut her off. "Of course you didn't. You've never had to sit up at night wondering if the man you love is going to break down again, if he'll make it through another day. You've never had to remind him that he's still here, that he still matters, that what he did wasn't in vain." Lisa took a hesitant step forward, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry," she said, her tone barely above a whisper. "I didn't know." Mary's shoulders softened just slightly, the fire in her eyes dimming. "You didn't know," she repeated, her voice gentler. "And that's part of the problem. Too many people don't know. They see a uniform and make assumptions. They don't see the man beneath it, the scars he hides, the battles he still fights every day." Lisa lowered her gaze, her colorful hair falling over her face. "I was angry," she admitted. "I've lost people too, and I didn't know where to put that anger. I guess I put it in the wrong place." Mary tilted her head, studying the younger woman. "Loss doesn't justify cruelty," she said quietly, "but it does explain it. If you're willing to listen, maybe we can help you understand." Lisa looked up, her tear-streaked face vulnerable and open. "I'd like that," she said hesitantly. Mary nodded and gestured for her to sit. Lisa sank onto the bench beside them, her hands folded nervously in her lap. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then, with a deep breath, Mary began to tell the story she had kept locked away for years. The day Jim came home, the weight he carried, and the promise they made to keep going despite it all. Lisa listened intently, her earlier defiance replaced by quiet humility. As Mary spoke, Jim's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining to share the burden of the memories. By the time Mary finished, Lisa's tears had dried, but her expression was one of profound understanding. "Thank you," Lisa said softly, "for helping me see." Mary gave her a small, weary smile. "It's not just for you, Lisa. It's for them. For the ones who never got the chance to tell their stories." Jim finally spoke, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "If you want to honor them, Lisa, don't just say you're sorry. Do something with what you've learned today. Remember their sacrifice and let it guide you." Lisa nodded, her resolve clear. "I will," she promised. And for the first time since the day began, Mary felt a glimmer of hope. The next day, the sky was overcast, casting a somber gray light over Westwood. Jim and Mary sat in their living room, the framed portrait resting on the coffee table. The air was heavy, not with tension, but with the echoes of yesterday's confrontation. Mary had been quiet all morning, lost in thought. She sipped her coffee slowly, her gaze fixed on the portrait of Jim's younger self. "Do you think she meant it?" Mary asked finally, breaking the silence. "Do you think Lisa will change?" Jim sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I think she wants to. Whether she does or not, well, that's up to her." He reached for the portrait, his fingers tracing the edge of the frame. His eyes lingered on the face in the photo, determined, hopeful, and so very young. "It's not easy to let go of anger. I know that better than anyone." Mary set down her coffee and looked at him intently. You've carried so much for so long, Jim. Maybe it's time to let someone else carry a part of it." Jim frowned, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Mary leaned forward, placing her hand over his. Tell her. Tell her the story. All of it." Jim stiffened, his grip on the portrait tightening. "Mary, I don't—" "She needs to hear it," Mary interrupted gently but firmly. "Not just for her, but for you. You've held this inside for decades, Jim. Maybe it's time to let it out." Jim hesitated, his gaze dropping to the photograph. He could still remember the day it was taken, as if it were yesterday. The smell of dust and oil, the weight of the uniform, the nervous energy coursing through him as the camera clicked. It had been a day of hope and fear, pride and uncertainty, a day before everything changed. That afternoon, Jim and Mary walked to the park. The memorial was quiet, the silence broken only by the rustling leaves and distant chirps of birds. Lisa was already there, sitting on a bench with her head bowed. She looked up as they approached, her face weary but expectant. "You came," Lisa said, standing as they neared. Mary nodded and gestured for her to sit again. "We have something to share with you, something you need to hear." Lisa looked between them, her expression curious but cautious. "What is it?" Jim sat beside her, placing the portrait on the bench. He took a deep breath, his fingers trembling slightly as he began. "This picture," he said, his voice low, "was taken the day before my unit left for our final mission. We were young, full of ideals, full of hope, but we were scared. We knew the risks, but we believed in what we were doing." Lisa's eyes flicked to the portrait, her lips pressing into a thin line. "It was supposed to be a straightforward mission," Jim continued, his voice growing steadier. "But things went wrong. We were ambushed. They were waiting for us, and we didn't stand a chance." Mary placed a comforting hand on his shoulder as Jim paused, his throat tightening. "I lost so many that day," he said, his voice breaking. "My brothers, men I'd trained with, laughed with, cried with. They gave their lives to protect me, to protect each other, and I came back." Lisa's eyes glistened, but she said nothing, letting him continue. "When I got home, I couldn't face myself. I couldn't understand why I was alive when they weren't. I carried that guilt with me for years. It's still with me, every day. That's why I wear this uniform. Not for recognition, not for pride, but for them. To honor their memory. To remind people of the cost of freedom." Lisa wiped at her eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know." Jim nodded slowly. "I don't blame you, Lisa. You didn't know. But now you do, and what you do with that knowledge, that's what matters." Mary leaned forward, her gaze steady. "This isn't just about Jim, or even the men he lost. It's about understanding the sacrifices people make for others, even when it costs them everything. It's about seeing the humanity behind the uniform." Lisa swallowed hard, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I want to do better," she said, her voice trembling. "I want to honor them, like you said." Jim gave her a small, sad smile. "Then start by listening, by learning, by telling others what you've learned. That's how you honor them. That's how you make their sacrifice mean something." The three of them sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Jim's story settling over them like a heavy blanket. The wind rustled the leaves overhead, carrying with it a sense of quiet resolution. Finally, Lisa spoke, her voice firm. "Thank you for sharing this, for trusting me with it. I won't let it go to waste." Jim nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's not about trust, Lisa. It's about giving people a chance to see the world differently. I hope you do." As they parted ways, Lisa walked away with a new sense of purpose, her colorful hair catching the fading light. Jim and Mary watched her go, their hands intertwined. For the first time in a long time, Jim felt a small part of the burden he carried begin to lift. Mary squeezed his hand, her voice soft. "You did the right thing, Jim." He looked at her, his eyes filled with quiet gratitude. "I hope so, Mary. I really hope so." The days following the park conversation were quiet, yet charged with something unspoken. For Jim and Mary, the confrontation with Lisa had stirred old memories and opened a door they never expected to open. Jim continued his routine of fixing things around the house, but Mary noticed the occasional pause. Jim standing still, his hand resting on the framed photograph of his younger self. Mary didn't press him, knowing his silences held conversations only he could have. But she couldn't deny the subtle shift in her husband. There was something lighter about him, as if a small part of the weight he had carried for years had been eased, even if just a little. One afternoon, as Mary prepared tea, a knock sounded at the door. Jim opened it to find Lisa standing there, her colorful hair tied back and her eyes brimming with determination. She held a notebook and pen tightly in her hands, her posture tense but resolute. "May I come in?" Lisa asked softly, her voice carrying the weight of both an apology and a plea. Jim hesitated for a moment before stepping aside. "Of course." Mary emerged from the kitchen, surprised but composed. "Lisa," she said, her tone curious, "what brings you here?" Lisa swallowed hard, her knuckles white as she gripped the notebook. "I've been thinking about what you said, about sacrifice, about understanding, and I realized I don't know enough. Mr. Warren." She turned to Jim, her voice trembling. "I want to learn. I want to hear your story, and the stories of others like you." Jim exchanged a glance with Mary, who nodded gently. He gestured toward the dining table. "It's not an easy story to tell," he said as he sat down, "but if you're willing to listen, I'll share it." Lisa nodded and took a seat, opening her notebook and clicking her pen. "I'm ready," she said, though her voice carried the vulnerability of someone unsure of what she was about to uncover. Jim began slowly, describing his childhood in a small, close-knit town. He spoke of his dreams of becoming a teacher and the day those dreams shifted when the war began. "I enlisted because I felt it was the right thing to do," he said. "I didn't know what I was walking into, but I believed in what I was fighting for." Mary joined them, adding her memories. She described the letters she received from Jim during his deployment, the nights she spent awake, worrying, and the day he returned. Not the man she had married, but someone forever changed by what he had endured. Lisa listened intently, scribbling furiously in her notebook. Her pen didn't stop moving until Jim's voice faltered, the steadiness giving way as he recounted the ambush. He described the chaos, the deafening gunfire, and the faces of the men who had fallen around him. His voice broke as he spoke of his survival, how he had been one of the few to make it out alive. "I lost so many that day," Jim said, his voice barely audible. "My brothers, men I trained with, laughed with, trusted. They gave their lives to protect me and each other. And I came back." Lisa's pen slipped from her hand, her tears streaming freely now. She wiped her eyes, her earlier confidence replaced by humility. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I had no idea how much you went through, how much all of you went through." Jim's gaze softened as he looked at her. "It wasn't just me, Lisa. It was all of us. And it still is, for the families of those who didn't come home. That's why I tell these stories, not for myself, but for them." Lisa nodded, her voice trembling. "Thank you for sharing this with me," she said. "I don't deserve it, but I'm grateful." Mary placed her hand on Lisa's. "You're here, Lisa. You're listening. That's what matters." Lisa closed her notebook, her expression earnest. "I want to do something with this. I want to share these stories so that people like me can understand, so that we don't forget." Jim smiled faintly, the lines on his face softening. Then, you've already started honoring them. The hours passed as they shared more stories, moving from moments of laughter to deep silences. Lisa's notebook became a tapestry of emotions, raw, unfiltered truths that she would carry with her. Jim even shared details of quiet acts of camaraderie during the war, the moments that reminded him of humanity, even amidst chaos. Before leaving, Lisa lingered in the doorway, her colorful hair catching the fading light. "I'll be back," she said. "There's so much more I need to learn." Jim nodded, his heart lighter than it had been in years. "You're always welcome, Lisa." Mary stood at the doorway watching Lisa walk down the path. She turned to Jim, her voice soft but sure. "She's changing," Mary said. Jim nodded, his voice quiet but steady. "She is. And maybe, so am I." The words hung between them, carrying both truth and hope. As Mary turned back inside, she glanced at the photograph on the coffee table, the younger version of Jim staring back with quiet determination. That same determination was reflected in her husband now, softened by time and tempered by understanding. They were moving forward, together. Weeks passed, and Lisa's visits to Jim and Mary's home became more frequent. Each visit brought new questions, new conversations, and a deepening understanding of the lives they had lived. Lisa's notebook grew heavier with the weight of their words, filled with stories, memories, and lessons she had never imagined. On one crisp morning, Lisa arrived with a mix of excitement and nerves. She knocked on the door, clutching her notebook tightly. Mary greeted her with a smile. "Come in, Lisa," Mary said, stepping aside. "You've got that look again, like you're about to surprise us." Lisa laughed softly, though her hands trembled. "I've been working on something," she admitted. "Something to honor your stories." Jim, seated in his favorite chair by the window, looked up from the framed photograph resting on the table beside him. "Let's hear it," he said simply. Lisa unfolded a piece of paper, her fingers shaking as she smoothed it out. She took a deep breath before reading. "They say history is written in books, carved in stone, and told in speeches. But true history lives in the hearts of those who lived it. It breathes in the voices of those who carry its weight. These stories, of sacrifice, of love, of loss, remind us that freedom is not free, that courage comes with a cost, and that humanity endures even in the face of unimaginable pain. I have listened to the stories of a man who wears his uniform not as a badge of honor, but as a testament to the brothers he lost and the sacrifices they made. I have learned from the woman who stood by his side, carrying her own burdens while holding him up. Their strength, their resilience, their love, these are the threads that weave the fabric of history. We must carry these stories forward, not to glorify war, but to honor those who gave everything for others, because it is through understanding that we find connection, and through connection that we find hope." Lisa's voice cracked as she finished. She looked up to see tears glistening in Mary's eyes and Jim's steady, thoughtful gaze fixed on her. "That's beautiful," Jim said finally, his voice low but filled with emotion. "You've captured something important, something I've struggled to say for years." Mary reached out, taking Lisa's hand. "You've turned our pain into something meaningful. Thank you." Lisa smiled through her own tears. "I couldn't have done it without you, without your stories." Jim nodded. "It's not just our stories, Lisa. They belong to everyone who's ever served, to every family who's ever waited, to everyone who's ever lost. What you've written, it's a bridge, a way for people to understand." In the weeks that followed, Lisa expanded her piece into a larger project. She reached out to other veterans, listening to their stories and collecting artifacts, photographs, and letters. With the help of the community, she organized an event to honor those who had served, a gathering she called Voices of Sacrifice, a bridge to understanding. The event was held in the same park where Lisa had first confronted Jim. This time, the atmosphere was different. The air buzzed with anticipation, and the park was transformed into a space of remembrance. Tables displayed photographs, letters, and artifacts, each telling a story of its own. Veterans stood side by side with young students, families, and curious locals, bridging gaps of age and experience. Lisa stood on a small stage, her colorful hair tied back in a simple braid. She gripped the microphone tightly, her heart pounding as she looked out at the crowd. But when her eyes met Jim's and Mary's in the front row, she felt a surge of strength. She spoke with conviction, sharing what she had learned from Jim and Mary and reading aloud the piece she had written. Her voice carried through the park, weaving a tapestry of understanding and connection. As she spoke, the crowd grew silent, hanging on every word. When she finished, there was a moment of stillness before the applause erupted. Lisa stepped down from the stage, her legs trembling, and was immediately enveloped in a hug from Mary. "You did it," Mary whispered. "You built the bridge." Jim extended his hand, his expression soft but serious. "Thank you, Lisa, for listening, for understanding, for carrying these stories forward." Lisa shook his hand, her own grip firm. "Thank you, Mr. Warren, for trusting me." As the event continued, Jim and Mary watched as people shared stories, exchanged hugs, and connected in ways that hadn't seemed possible before. For the first time in years, Jim felt a sense of peace, a realization that the memories he carried were no longer his burden alone. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, Jim looked at Mary and smiled. "It was worth it," he said softly. Mary nodded, resting her hand on his arm. "It always has been." Surrounded by warmth and connection, they knew their stories, and those of so many others, had finally found a home.